Welcome to the Nerdjacker's Vault. Today we are reading Book 1 from the Anabasis of Alexander by Greek historian Arrian, translated by E. Elif Robson and Syed Mahdi Hassan. Chapter 1. Wherever Ptolemy son of Lagus and Aristobulus son of Aristobulus have agreed in their histories of Alexander son of Philip, I record their story as quite accurate. Where they disagree, I have chosen what I feel to be more likely and also better worth the narrating. Others have given various accounts of Alexander. In fact, there is no one over whom historians have been more numerous and less harmonious. My own view is that Ptolemy and Aristobulus are more trustworthy narrators, for Aristobulus took the field with King Alexander. Ptolemy not only did the same, but, as he was a king himself, falsehood would have been more shameful to him than to anyone else. Besides, since Alexander was dead when they both wrote their histories, there lay on them neither any constraint nor any hope of gain in writing other than plain fact. Parts, however, of the records of others, such as appeared to me worthy of narration, and not wholly untrustworthy, I have included as so much tradition about Alexander. Should anyone be surprised, when there is such abundance of writers, that it should have occurred to me also to compose this history, I beg him to reserve his surprise till he has first surveyed their work and made the acquaintance of mine. The death of Philip is placed in the archonship of Pythodamus at Athens. Alexander, then about 20, succeeded, being Philip's son, and came into the Peloponnesus. So runs the story. There he gathered together the Peloponnesian Greeks and requested from them the leadership of the Persian expedition, which they had already granted to Philip. All agreed except the Lacedaemonians, who replied that their country's custom did not permit them to follow others. It was theirs to take the lead of others. The Athenians also made some show of violence, but they collapsed at Alexander's first approach and conceded to him a position even more honorable than had been given to Philip. Alexander then returned to Macedonia and began to get ready for the Asian expedition. In the spring he went Thracewards to the Triballi and Illyrians, since he learned that they were restless. Moreover, as they marched with his boarders, he did not think well to leave them behind him when going on an expedition so far from home, unless they were thoroughly subdued. Starting from Amphipolis, he invaded Thrace, that is, the territory of the independent Thracians, with Philippi and Mount Orbulus on his left. Then, so the historians tell us, he crossed the river Nessus and in 10 days reached Mount Haemus, where there met him in the defile of the approach to the mountain many of the merchants in arms and the independent Thracians. They had occupied the height of Haemus, and were all ready to bar the progress of the expedition, which must needs pass the height. Collecting carts and throwing them in advance, they proposed to use the carts as a stockade from which to put up a defense if they were pressed, but it was also part of their strategy to launch the carts at the Macedonian phalanx as the troops mounted the slope just where the mountain was most sheer. Their idea was that the closer the phalanx when the descending carts charged it, the more their violent descent would scatter it. Alexander, however, consulted how he could most safely cross the ridge, and since he saw that the risk must be run, for there was no way round, he sent orders to his men-at-arms that at whatsoever time the carts swooped down the slope upon them, those who, being on level ground, could break formation, were to part to right and left, leaving an avenue for the carts. Those who should be caught in the narrows were to form close together. And some actually falling to the ground were to link their shields closely together, so that the carts coming at them, and as was to be hoped bounding over them by their gathered impetus, should pass through without doing harm. And thus it happened, according to Alexander's orders and anticipation. The one lot parted their phalanx, and the carts sliding over the shields of the others did little harm. Not one man perished beneath the carts. The Macedonians now took heart of grace, finding that those most dreaded chariots proved harmless, and raising their cheer charged the Thracians. Alexander sent for the archers from the right wing to the front of the other phalanx, this being the more convenient side, to shoot thence at the Thracians whenever they attacked. He himself took the shock troops, the foot guards, and the Agrianes, and led them to the left, where the archers by their volleys held up any advances of the Thracians, and the phalanx had no grave difficulty, coming to close quarters, in driving from their position the lightly clad and ill-armed Highlanders, who, in fact, did not await Alexander leading on his men from the left, but casting away their arms helter-skelter, fled down the mountainside. 1,500 perished, few were captured alive, by reason of their speed and their local knowledge. The women, however, who had followed them, were all taken with the children and all their impedimenta. Chapter 2. Alexander sent the booty to the rear, to the cities on the coast, appointing Lysanias and Philotas to deal with it. Then himself crossing the ridge, he marched through Hemus to the Tribalians, and so arrived at the river Liginus. As you approach Hemus, it is 3 days' march from the Ister. Syrmus, king of the Tribalians, learning some time before of Alexander's march, sent on the women and children to the Ister, ordering them to cross to an island in the river called Pus. To this island the Thracians, who are neighbors to the Tribalians, had fled on Alexander's approach, and Syrmus and his suite also, but the mass of the Tribalians fled back to the river whence Alexander had started out the day before. Hearing of their move, Alexander turned back to attack the Tribalians, and found them already encamping. They, caught as they were, formed line near the glen by the river, but Alexander in person, throwing his phalanx into deep formation, led it against them, ordering the bowmen and slingers to skirmish ahead and discharge their arrows and stones upon the tribesmen, to see if he could entice them into the open from the glen. They, when in range, receiving these volleys, rushed forward upon the bowmen to come to grips with them, being unarmed as bowmen are. But Alexander, having brought them out of the glen, ordered Philotas to take the cavalry of Upper Macedonia and charge their right wing, where they had advanced farthest in their outward rush. Heraclides and Sopolis he ordered to lead the cavalry from Bataea and Amphipolis against the left wing. The foot phalanx and the remaining cavalry, which he deployed in advance of the phalanx, he led against the center. While the battle was still at long range, the Tribalians held firm, but when the phalanx in close formation charged them stoutly, and the cavalry, no longer shooting, but actually thrusting them with their horses, fell on them here, there, and everywhere, the enemy turned and rushed through the glen to the river. 3,000 perished in the flight, but only a few were caught alive, owing to the density of the wood which lay in front of the river, and because nightfall prevented the Macedonians from any thorough pursuit. Of the Macedonians, according to Ptolemy, 11 cavalrymen and about 40 foot soldiers perished. Chapter 3. 3 days after the battle, Alexander reached the Ister, the greatest river of Europe, draining the greatest tract of country, and acting as a barrier to very warlike tribes, Celts for the most part, its springs rising in Celtic territory. The farthest of these peoples are the Quadi and Marcomanni. Then it passes the Iazuges, a branch of the Soromate, the Getae, who call themselves immortals, the bulk of the Soromate, and the Scythians as far as the outlets, where through 5 mouths it runs into the Black Sea. There Alexander finds at the mouth of the river warships come to join him from Byzantium through the Black Sea. These he manned with archers and men-at-arms, and sailed against the island where the Tribalians and Thracians had taken refuge, and endeavored to force a landing. The tribesmen, however, kept swooping down to the riverside wherever the ships touched land. These were few in number, and carrying only a small body of troops. The island was for the most part steep for landing, and the current passed the island, as was natural in the narrows, was swift and difficult to contend with. Thereupon Alexander withdrew his troops and decided to cross the Ister to attack the Getae, who were settled on the farther side, both because he saw a large force of them gathered on the bank to repel him should he cross. There were about 4,000 mounted men and more than 10,000 on foot, and also because he had been seized with a desire to land on the farther side. He himself embarked in the fleet, the leather tent covers he had filled with the hay, and gathering all the available boats, cut from single trees. From the countryside there were plenty, for the riverside dwellers used them for fishing, for upriver expeditions among themselves, and even more for thieving. He ferried across on these as much of his force as was possible. About 1,500 cavalry and 4,000 foot soldiers crossed with him. Chapter 4. The crossing was made at night, where there was a deep cornfield, and this concealed them the more, as they kept close to the bank. About dawn, Alexander led the troops through the field, ordering the infantry to smooth down the corn with their spears, held obliquely, and so lead the way to untilled ground. As long as the phalanx was marching through the calm, the cavalry followed, but when they emerged from the tilled land, Alexander in person took off the cavalry to the right wing, ordering Nicanor to lead off the phalanx in oblong formation. On open ground the various units formed squares, and the whole phalanx moved in column of march in rectangular shape, broader than it was deep. The Getae did not sustain even the first charge of the cavalry, for Alexander's bold stroke came as a great shock to them, in that he so easily crossed the Ister, greatest of rivers, in one night without so much as bridging the stream. The solidity of the phalanx was terrifying, and the onslaught of the cavalry violent. First the enemy took refuge in the city, about a parasang away from the Ister. Then, seeing Alexander bring up his phalanx along the river, that the infantry might not be caught by any ambush of the Getae, with the cavalry on the front, the enemy deserted in turn their city, which was feebly fortified, taking up on their cruppers as many of the women and children as the horses could carry, and then marched as far as possible away from the river towards the desert. Alexander captured the city and whatever plunder the Getae had left behind. This plunder he ordered Meleager and Philip to take to the base. He razed the city and sacrificed on the bank of the Ister to Zeus the preserver and Heracles and Ister himself for permitting the passage. Then in daylight he took all his force safe and sound back to the camp. At this juncture came commissioners to Alexander from the other self-governing tribes along the Ister, and from Syrmus, king of the Triballi, others from the Celts settled on the Ionian Gulf. The Celts were tall and haughty, but all professed desire for Alexander's friendship, and he gave to all, and received from all, proper assurances. Of the Celts he inquired what, of mortal things, they most dreaded, hoping that his own great name had reached as far as the Celts and farther, and that they would confess that they dreaded him beyond all else. Their answer, however, proved unexpected to him, for, living as they did in difficult country far from Alexander, and seeing that his invasion was really directed elsewhere, they said that their greatest dread was lest the sky should fall upon them. He declared them his friends, made alliance, and sent them home, casually remarking, "What braggarts these Celts are." Chapter 5. He then went towards the Agrianes and the Paeonies. There a message reached him that Clytus son of Bardalus was in revolt, and that Glaucius, king of the Taulantians, had joined him. The messengers also told him that the Autariates were going to attack him on his march. For these reasons it was thought well to move off as soon as possible. Langeros, king of the Agrianes, was known to have shown regard for Alexander even in Philip's lifetime. He had also been on an embassy to him personally. On the present occasion he was in attendance on Alexander with his bodyguard, the finest and best armed troops he had. And when he learnt that Alexander was inquiring who and in what numbers these Auteriates were, he told Alexander that he need not trouble about them. They were the least warlike of the tribesmen in those parts. He would himself invade their country, so that they might rather be occupied with their own affairs. Alexander agreed, and he invaded them, devastating their country. Thus the Auteriates were busy with their own matters, Langeros receiving high honor from Alexander, and also what were considered at the court of Macedon the highest gifts. Alexander besides promised to wed his sister Sina to him when he came to Pella. Langeros, however, after reaching home, sickened and died. Alexander, marching along the river Aragon, made for Pellium. This city Claitus had taken, as being the strongest in the country. When Alexander reached it, he camped by the river Erdicus and decided to assault next day. Claitus' forces, however, held the heights surrounding the city, which were commanding and also thickly wooded, so that they could attack the Macedonians if they made the assault, from all sides, Glaucius, king of the Taulantians, not yet being present. Alexander proceeded to the assault, on which the enemy sacrificed 3 boys and 3 girls and 3 black rams, and then made a rush to intercept the Macedonian right wing. But when the Greeks drew near, they deserted the strong positions they had occupied, and the newly sacrificed victims were found still lying there. On this day Alexander shut them up in their city and camped by the wall, intending to hem them in by a circumvallation. But next day Glaucius, king of the Taulantians, appeared with a large force. Thereupon Alexander gave up the idea of taking the city with such forces as he had. A good many bold warriors had ensconced themselves therein, and Glaucius' strong force would fall upon him should he assault the wall. He sent Philotas, therefore, with so many horsemen as he needed as a screen, and all the baggage animals from the camp to forage. Glaucius, getting wind of this move of Philotas, swooped down on his troops, and captured the heights which encircled the plain, whence Philotas's troops proposed to obtain their forage. Alexander, however, when it was reported to him that both the cavalry and the baggage animals were in grave danger, should night overtake them, took his bodyguard and archers and the Agrianes and 400 horsemen, and made at full speed to the rescue. The rest of the army he left near the city, lest, if the whole force had withdrawn, the enemy in the city might have sallied out and joined forces with Glaucius. Glaucius, on seeing Alexander's approach, deserted the heights, and Philotas and his convoy got safe back to the camp. Even so, Claitus and Glaucius with their troops appeared to have caught Alexander in a disadvantageous position, for they held the commanding heights with a good many horsemen, javelin men, and slingers, and a fair number of men-at-arms, and the city forces were ready to attack Alexander as he drew off, while the ground through which Alexander must pass seemed narrow and marshy, bounded on the one side by the river, and on the other side was a lofty mountain and hill crests towards the mountain, so that the army could only pass through 4 abreast. Chapter 6. Alexander, under the circumstances, extended the front of his phalanx so as to give a depth of 120 files. On either wing he posted 200 horsemen, bidding them keep silent, a command they obeyed smartly. The men-at-arms he ordered first to raise their spears upright, and then, on the word, to lower them for a charge, inclining first to the right their serried points, then to the left. The phalanx itself he moved smartly forward, and then wheeled it here and there on either wing. Thus he displayed and maneuvered various formations in a brief time, and then, making a spearhead from his phalanx on the left, he led it to the attack. The enemy, already bewildered both at the smartness and the discipline of these maneuvers, did not await the approach of the Greeks, but deserted the first row of hills. Alexander bade the Macedonians raise their cheer and clang their spears upon their shields, and the Taulantians, even more astounded at the noise, hastily withdrew to the city. Alexander saw some few of the enemy holding one of the hills by which his passage lay, and ordered his bodyguards and his squires to take their shields, mount, and charge the hill. On reaching it, supposing those who held it should stand their ground, half were to dismount, and mingling with the cavalry, fight on foot. The enemy, observing this dash of Alexander's, deserted the hill and inclined towards either of the mountains. Alexander then captured the hill with his squires, sent for the Agrianes and the archers, to the number of 2,000. The guards he ordered to cross the river, and following them, the columns of the Macedonian troops. As soon as they should be across, they were to extend to the left, literally shieldwards, that is, to the left hand, as spearwards was to the right hand, so that the phalanx might appear solid the moment they had crossed. He, with the advance guard, kept an eye from the hill on the enemy's movement. They, seeing the force crossing, charged down the hill with the idea of attacking Alexander's bodyguard as they withdrew last. He, as they now approached, makes a sally with his troops, and the phalanx coming to the attack through the river raised its battle cry. Under this combined onslaught they broke and fled, whereupon Alexander brought up the Agrianes and the archers at the double in the direction of the river. He himself got over first, but seeing the enemy pressing on the hindmost, he set up his engines on the bank and ordered every kind of missile to be discharged from them at utmost range. What is more, he commanded the archers in mid-river to shoot volleys thence, they too having breasted the stream. Glaucia's troops did not venture within range. The Macedonians meanwhile crossed the river safely and lost not a man in the withdrawal. 3 days later, Alexander learned that Claidus and Glaucia's troops were carelessly bivouacked, no sentries set in due order, no palisade, no trench, for they thought that Alexander had retreated in panic, and their line unduly elongated. He crossed the river under cover of night with the guards, the Agrianes, the archers, and the troops of Perdiccas and Coenus. He had left orders for the rest of the army to follow, but seeing the time opportune for attack, he did not await the concentration, but sent on all the archers and the Agrianes. They made a surprise attack, and in column, a formation in which they were likely to make the strongest onslaught on the enemy just where he was weakest. They slew several as they slept, easily seized the fugitives, so that many were caught and killed there and then, and many also in their panic-stricken and headlong flight. A good number were taken alive. Alexander's company pursued to the mountains of the Taulantians. Those who did escape only escaped by jettison of their arms. Claidus, who at first took to the city, set fire to it and fled to Glaucius among the Taulantians. Chapter 7. Meanwhile, some of the fugitives from Thebes slipped into Thebes by night. Certain persons inviting them with a view to a rising, seized from the city Amintas and Timolaus from among the force occupying the Cadmea, having no suspicion of hostile movement outside, and slew them. Then appearing in the assembly, they incited the Thebans to rebel against Alexander, holding out the lures of freedom and liberty of speech, time-honored and attractive titles, and the shaking off, at long last, of Macedon's heavy yoke. They won additional adherents from the populace by stoutly affirming that Alexander had died in Illyria. This was common talk, and from various sources. He had been long away, and no word had come from him, so that, in ignorance of hard fact, they conjectured, as so often happens, what they most desired. Alexander, hearing of what occurred at Thebes, took things seriously, for he had long had his suspicions about Athens, and was much concerned about the Theban attempt, should the infection of revolt spread to the Lacedaemonians, who are already rebels at heart, and other Peloponnesians, to say nothing of the Aetolians, themselves also unreliable. He marches, therefore, along Eordea and Elamiotis, past the heights of Stymphea and Perivea, and on the 7th day reaches Pallina in Thessaly. Thence in 6 days he entered Boeotia, so that the Thebans did not learn of his passage of the gates until his arrival, with all his force at Onchestus. Thereupon those who had brought about the revolt said that a force of Antipater had come from Macedon, and confidently affirmed Alexander's death, getting annoyed at any who reported Alexander's actual presence at the head of his men. It was, said they, another Alexander, son of Aripus. Alexander, leaving Onchestus next day, reached Thebes, near the enclosure of Iolaus. There he encamped, giving the Thebans a period of grace, in case they should repent and send an embassy to him. They were far from showing any humility that might lead to an agreement. Nay, the horsemen and several light troops sallied out towards the camp and discharged long-range volleys at the outposts, even killing a few of the Macedonians. Alexander sent out some of his light troops and archers to hold up their sally. They easily checked the Thebans, who by now were actually approaching the camp. Next day Alexander moved his whole force and came round to the gates leading to Eleuthera and Attica, and yet even then did not assault the walls, but pitched camp not far from the Cadmea, so that support was close at hand for the Macedonians who held the Cadmea. For the Thebans were investing the Cadmea, having built a double stockade, so that no one from without could help those invested within, nor they sally out and harm the Thebans when in touch with their enemies without. But Alexander, for he still hoped to be friend, not foe, to Thebes, waited, encamped near the citadel. Then the more public-spirited citizens of Thebes were anxious to go forth to Alexander and win pardon for the Theban people as a whole for their revolt. But the exiles and those who had called them in would not condescend to receive any kindness from Alexander, especially as some of them were officers of the Confederacy of Boeotia. They therefore sought in all ways to urge their countrymen to war. Yet even so Alexander did not attack. Chapter 8. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, however, says that Perdiccas, who was officer in charge of the camp guard with his own detachment and lay not far from the enemy palisade, did not await Alexander's signal for battle, but himself first attacked the palisade and tearing it asunder broke in upon the Theban advance guard. Amyntas, son of Andromenes, followed, being brigaded with Perdiccas, and led on his detachment so soon as he saw Perdiccas advanced within the palisade. Then Alexander, seeing this, so that they might not be stranded and so at the mercy of the Thebans, brought up the rest of the army. The archers and the Agrianes he ordered to make a diversion inside the palisade, but he still retained his shock troops and his guard outside. Then Perdiccas, trying to force his way into the second palisade, was wounded and lay where he fell. He was borne off, in sorry plight, to the camp, and only with difficulty was healed of his wound. His men, joining Alexander's archers, hemmed the Thebans in the sunken road leading down by the Heracleum. While the Thebans retreated towards the Heracleum, the Macedonians followed. But then the Thebans turned to bay with a shout, and the Macedonians to flight. There fell Eurybotus the Cretan, commander of the archers, and about 70 of his men. The rest took refuge with the Macedonian picked troops, and with the royal guards. In the meanwhile, Alexander, seeing his troops fugitives, and the Thebans in loosened order in the pursuit, charged them with phalanx in battle formation. The Thebans were pushed inside the gates. Their flight became so far a panic that while being thrust through the gates into the city, they could not shut the gates in time. So there actually passed in with them within the wall such of the Macedonians as were pressing on the fugitives. The walls being now undefended on account of the large number of advanced posts. Those from this side passed into the Cadmea along the Amphium with the holders of the Cadmea, and passed into the city proper. Those by the walls, already held by the troops that had poured in together with the fugitives, passed over the walls and rushed to the marketplace. For a while the Theban armed forces stood their ground by the Amphium, but as the Macedonians pressed upon them from all sides, and Alexander appeared now here, now there. The Theban cavalry, pushing their way through the city, streamed out upon the plain. With the infantry, it was a state of panic. And then, in hot blood, it was not so much the Macedonians as Phocians and Plataeans and the other Boeotians who slaughtered broadcast the unresisting Thebans, some in their houses, breaking a way into them, some showing fight, others even suppliant in the temples and sparing neither woman nor child. Chapter 9. This disaster of Greeks, both by the size of the captured city and by the sharpness of the action, and not least by the general unexpectedness of the event, both to victors and victims, caused as much horror to the other Greeks as to those who had a hand in it. The Sicilian disaster of the Athenians, if in number of the slain it brought a similar disaster upon the city, yet, since their army was destroyed far from home, and that, too, an army rather of allies than of citizens, and their city being left to them, so that they held out some time in the war against Sparta, their allies, and Persia, even this, I say, gave no such sense of calamity to the sufferers, and did not strike the Greeks generally with such horror and amazement at the catastrophe. Or again, the Athenian defeat at Aegospotami was at sea, and the city reduced indeed to humility by the destruction of its long walls, the surrender of most of its ships, and loss of its sovereignty, yet retained its former shape, and soon recovered its former strength. Built, in fact, once more its long walls, won again its sea power, and actually saved in some measure from severe danger those very Lacedaemonians, then so terrible, who had come so near to destroying Athens. The defeat of the Lacedaemonians themselves at Leuctra and Mantinea came as a great shock to them, rather by the unexpectedness of the disaster than by the number of the slain. The onslaught of Epaminondas with his Boeotians and Arcadians upon Sparta scared the Spartans and their allies rather by the strangeness of such a sight than the gravity of the danger. The capture, again, of Plataea was not a very serious affair, because of the small number of those captured in the city, the greater number having fled long before to Athens. Finally, the capture of Melos and Sione, which were merely island fortresses, rather brought shame to the captors than any great shock to the Greeks in general. With Thebes, on the other hand, the hastiness of the revolt, her want of reasoned policy, her sudden capture, with so little trouble to the victors, the massacre, such as arises from kindred tribes wreaking ancient vengeance, the complete enslavement of the city, then one of the first in Greece in power and military prestige, were quite naturally set down to divine wrath. Thebes, men said, had thus paid the price, at length, of her betrayal of the Greek cause in the Persian wars, of her seizure of Plataea during the truce, of her complete enslavement of the Plataeans, of the massacre, the work of Thebes, not of Greece, of men who had surrendered not to Thebes but to Sparta, of the devastation of the Plataean countryside, on which the Greeks, ranged shoulder to shoulder against Persia, had repelled the common danger of Greece, and last, of the vote cast for the destruction of Athens, when the suggestion was put before the allies of Sparta that the Athenians should be sold into slavery. People said that the coming disaster cast its shadow before, in many divine warnings, neglected then, but the memory thereof later made people realize that there had long been prognostications, now confirmed by the event. The allies who took part in the attack, to whom Alexander had entrusted the final settlement, decided to garrison the Cadmea, but to raise the city even with the ground, and to apportion its territory among the allies, save the sacred spots, and to enslave women and children, and any Theban survivors, save any who had friendship with Philip or Alexander, or any who had been patrons of Macedonians. The house of Pindar and any of his descendants Alexander saved, so it is related, from reverence for Pindar. Besides this, the allies determined to rebuild and fortify Orchomenus and Plataea. Chapter 10. When the fate of Thebes was notified to the Bather Greeks, The Arcadians who had left home to help Thebes condemned to death those who had persuaded them to take this step. The Eleans received their own fugitives, being on good terms with Alexander. The Aetolians sent embassies, tribe by tribe, and begged forgiveness, on the ground that they had revolted only because of the news brought from Thebes. The Athenians were celebrating their great mysteries when refugees came from Thebes, hot foot from the assault. In consternation, they abandoned the mysteries and began to get in their stuff from the country into the city. The people came into assembly, and on the motion of Demades chose 10 ambassadors from the whole body of citizens, men known to be on the most friendly terms with Alexander, and sent them to him bearing the city's rather unseasonable congratulations on his safe return from the Illyrians and Tribalians, and on his punishment of the Theban revolt. Alexander replied for the most part in friendly tone to the embassy, but wrote a letter to the city demanding the adherence of Demosthenes and Lycurgus, as well as Hyperides, Polyeuctus, Charis, Charidemus, Ephialtes, Diotimus, and Moracles. These he held responsible for the disaster of Chaeronea and wrongs later committed at Philip's death against himself and Philip. He also showed them to be guilty of the Theban rebellion, not less than the Theban rebels themselves. The Athenians did not give up these men, but sent a second embassy to Alexander, begging him to relax his wrath towards those whom he had demanded. Alexander did so, whether from regard for Athens, or because he was anxious to get on with his Asian expedition, and loath to leave anything behind in Greece which he could not trust. Charidemus alone, however, of those men whom he had demanded but not received, he ordered to be exiled, and he took refuge in Asia at the court of King Darius. When all this had been set in order, Alexander returned to Macedonia, where he sacrificed the traditional sacrifice established by Archelaus to Olympian Zeus and kept the Olympian games at Aegae. Others add that he held games in honor of the Muses. Meanwhile, word comes that the statue of Orpheus, son of Oeagrus the Thracian, in Pieria had sweated continuously. The seers interpreted this variously, but Aristandrus of Telmissae bade Alexander be of good cheer. It was signified, he said, that to makers of epics and choric songs and writers of odes there would be much toil to poetize and sing of Alexander and his exploits. Chapter 11. In early spring, Alexander marches to the Hellespont, leaving Macedonian and Greek affairs in charge of Antipatros. He led off of infantry, with light troops and archers, not much above 30,000, of cavalry over 5,000. His route was past Lake Cercinides in the direction of Amphipolis and the delta of the river Strymon. He crossed the Strymon and passed Mount Pangaeon, working towards Abdera and Maronea, Greek cities settled on the sea. Thence he reached the Hebrus and crossed it with ease. Thence through Paetic he reached the Black River, crossed it, and reached Cestus after 20 days marching in all from home. Arriving at Eleon, he sacrificed to Protesilaus at Protesilaus's tomb, since he was thought to be the first Greek of those who went with Agamemnon to Troy to disembark on Asian soil. The intention of the sacrifice was that the setting foot on Asian soil might be more prosperous to Alexander than to Protesilaus. Parmenio was appointed to see to the ferrying over from Cestus to Abydos of the greater part of the infantry and the cavalry. They crossed in 160 triremes and in a good number of cargo boats. Most authorities say that Alexander sailed from Elaeon to the Achaean harbor and steered the admiral's ship himself, sacrificing, when in the midst of the strait, a bull to Poseidon, and pouring into the sea a drink offering from a golden bowl to the goddesses of the sea. Further, legend says that he disembarked first on Asian soil, armed from head to foot, and set up altars both where he started from Europe and where he landed in Asia, to Zeus of safe landings, Athena, and Heracles. Then he ascended to Ilium, and sacrificed to Athena of Ilium, dedicated his full armor, laying it up in the temple, and took down in its place some of the dedicated arms yet remaining from the Trojan War. These, it is said, his bodyguard bore before him into battle. Then he sacrificed also to Priam at the altar of Zeus of enclosures, so runs the legend, praying Priam not to be wroth with the race of Neoptolemus, of which he himself was a scion. Chapter 12. When Alexander reached Ilium, Menoetius, the navigator, crowned him with a golden wreath, and so did Charis, the Athenian, arriving from Sigeum with others, Greeks or natives of the place. Then Hephaestion, they say, placed a wreath on Patroclus' tomb, and Alexander likewise on Achilles' tomb. Alexander, as is related, accounting Achilles happy in that he had a Homer to be the herald of his after fame. Alexander might well count Achilles happy on this score, since, fortunate as Alexander was in other ways, there was a great gap left here, and Alexander's exploits were never worthily bruited abroad. No one did so in narrative prose. No one sang of him in verse. Nay, not even in choral lyric was Alexander chanted, as were Hiero, Gelo, Thero, and many others, men not of Alexander's stature, whence Alexander's exploits are far less known than the minor deeds of past ages. Why, the Anabasis of the 10,000 with Cyrus against Artaxerxes, the sufferings of Clearchus and those captured with him, their descent to the sea, led by Xenophon, are, thanks to Xenophon, far better known to the world than Alexander and Alexander's exploits. Yet Alexander did not merely take the field with someone else. He did not run away from the great king, and only conquer those who tried to stop the seaward march. No one man gave proof of so many or such wondrous deeds, whether in number or greatness, among Greeks and Orientals alike. That, I declare, is why I have set forth to write this history, not judging myself unworthy to blazon before mankind the deeds of Alexander. This at least, whoever I am, I know in my favor. I need not write my name. It is not unknown among men, nor my country, nor my family, nor any office I may have held among my own folk. This I do set on paper, that this history is and was from my boyhood, my country, family, and offices. That is why I do not shrink from setting myself alongside of the masters of Greek speech, since my subject was first among the masters of Greek warfare. From Ilium Alexander came to Arisbe, where his whole force, after crossing the Hellespont, had encamped. Next day to Percote. The next he passed Lampsacus and camped by the river Practius, which flowing from Mount Ida runs into the sea that lies between the Hellespont and the Euxine Sea. Thence he came to Hermodos, passing by Colonae. He sent scouts ahead of the army. Amyntas, son of Arrhabaeus, led them, with the territorial squadron from Apollonia, whose squadron leader was Socrates, son of Sathon, with 4 squadrons of the advanced scouts, as they were called. On his passage the city Priapus was surrendered to him by the citizens, and he sent a party to take it over under Paragoras, son of Lycagoras, one of the territorials. The Persian commanders were Arsames, Rheomithras, Petins, Niphates, and with them Spithridates, the satrap of Lydia and Ionia, and Arsides, the governor of Hellespontine Phrygia. They had already encamped by the city of Zelaea with the Persian cavalry and the mercenary Greeks. When they held a council of war, Alexander's crossing having been reported, Memnon of Rhodes advised them to run no risk of war with the Macedonians, who were far their superiors in infantry, especially with Alexander actually on the spot, while Darius was far away from them. They had far best advance, destroying the fodder by trampling it with their cavalry and burning the growing crops, not sparing even their cities. For Alexander would not then stay in the country for want of provisions. Arsacides, however, is reported to have said in the Persian council that he would not suffer one house belonging to his men to be burned. The Persians supported Arsacides, having suspicions of Memnon, thinking that he was delaying warlike operations for the sake of the office he held from the king. Chapter 13. Meanwhile, Alexander was advancing to the river Granicus with his force all ready for battle, having doubled his phalanx of the men-at-arms, with the cavalry on the wings, and ordering the transport to follow behind the scouts and reconnoitering parties, which Hegelaus led, with the lancers and 500 light troops. Alexander was not far from the river Granicus, when the scouts, riding in at full speed, reported that the Persians were arrayed for battle on the farther side of the Granicus. Alexander then formed battle order, and Parmenio came forward and said, "My view, sir, is that we should encamp at once on the river bank, as we are. The enemy, I believe, being outnumbered in infantry, will not dare to bivouac near us, and hence we can easily cross at dawn, and we shall be across before they get into order. As things are, I feel that we should run great risk in taking action, since we cannot take an army across a river on a wide front, for one can see that there are many deep parts of the river. Its banks, as you see, are very high, sometimes like cliffs. As we emerge in disorder and in deployed order, the weakest of formations, the enemy cavalry in good solid order will charge. The first disaster would be grievous at the present, and most harmful for the general result of the war." Alexander, however, replied, "This I know, Parmenio, but I should feel ashamed if after our crossing so easily the Hellespont, this petty stream so disrespectfully did he speak of the Granicus, shall hinder us from crossing, just as we are. This I consider unworthy either of the prestige of the Macedonians or of my own swift dealing with danger. I believe the Persians would pluck up courage, thinking themselves as good fighters as the Macedonians, since up to the present they have not experienced anything to cause them alarm." Chapter 14. So spoke Alexander, and at once sent off Parmenio to lead the left wing. He himself passed along to the right. As commander of the right, he had already appointed Philotas, son of Parmenio, with the territorial cavalry, the archers, and the Agrianes, javelin men. To Philotas was attached Amyntas, son of Arrhabaeus, with the lancers, the Paeonians, and Socrates' squadron. Next to them were marshaled the territorial guards, led by Nicanor, son of Parmenio. Beside these was the phalanx of Perdiccas, son of Orontes, also that of Coenus, son of Polemocrates, and those of Craterus, son of Alexander, Amyntas, son of Andromenes, and the troops under Philip, son of Amyntas. On the left wing came first the Thessalian cavalry, commanded by Cal's son of Harpalus, next the allied cavalry, under Philip, son of Menelaus, then the Thracians, under Agetho. On their right were the infantry, the phalanx of Craterus, of Meleager, of Philip, up to the center of the whole force. The Persians had about 20,000 cavalry, and little short of the same number of infantry, foreign mercenaries. Their disposition was, the cavalry drawn up parallel to the river, and thus making an extended phalanx, the infantry behind them. The land above the bank was high and commanding. Where they perceived Alexander himself, you could not mistake him from the splendor of his equipment and the obsequious attendance of his suite. Opposite their left wing, they massed here on the bank their cavalry squadrons. For some time the two forces, on the river's brink, dreading to precipitate the event, remained at ease and in deep silence. The Persians awaited the Macedonians, to fall on them emerging from the river, so soon as they should attempt the crossing. But Alexander flung himself onto his horse, and calling on his suite to follow and show themselves brave men and true, he advanced his first line of scouts and the Paeonians into the stream, under command of Amyntas, son of Arrhabaeus, and also one file of the infantry. Before these he sends Socrates' squadron, Ptolemy, son of Philip, commanding. This was on the list as leading cavalry squadron for that day. Then he himself leading the right wing, bugles sounding, and the battle cry going up to the god of battles, boldly takes to the stream, inclining his troops obliquely to the current, so that the Persians should not fall on him in extended front, but that he himself might attack them, as far as might be, in close order. Chapter 15. The Persians, at the point where their vanguard, under Amyntas and Socrates, held the river bank, shot their volleys from above, some hurling their javelins from their commanding position a little removed from the bank, others on the more level ground, or even advancing down to the stream. There was a great scrimmage of the cavalry, the Greeks trying to land, the Persians to stop them, great showers of Persian javelins, much thrusting of Macedonian spears. But the Macedonians, much outnumbered, came off badly in the first onslaught. They were insecure, and below, the enemy on a strong position above. Besides, the flower of the Persian cavalry was posted at the landing, Memnon's sons and Memnon himself bearing the brunt along with them. The first of the Macedonians came into conflict with the Persians and were cut down, after prodigies of valor, all to a man, save those who fell back on Alexander as he approached. For he was already near, leading on the right wing, and he charged the Persians, himself the first to attack, just where was the press of cavalry and where the Persian commanders were posted. A fierce fight raged about him, and meanwhile the Macedonians, line after line, kept crossing, a task now not so difficult. It was a cavalry struggle, though on infantry lines, horse pressed against horse, man against man, wrestling one with another, Greeks trying to push, once for all, the Persians from the bank and force them onto the level ground, the Persians trying to bar their landing and hurl them back into the river. Already, however, Alexander and his guards were getting the best of it, not only through their forcefulness and their discipline, but because they were fighting with stout cornel-wood lances against short javelins. In the melee, Alexander's lance was broken. He called on Aretas, one of the royal aides, for another, but Aretas had also broken his lance, and was hard pressed, though putting up a brave fight with the half of his broken weapon. Showing this to Alexander, he cried out to him to call upon another aid, but Demaratus of Corinth, one of Alexander's squires, gave him his own lance. Alexander, grasping it, and seeing Mithridates, son-in-law of Darius, riding far ahead of the line and leading on a body of horse, formed in wedge shape, charges forth in advance of his men, thrusts his lance into Mithridates' face and hurls him to the ground. But Rosaces rode at Alexander, and smote him on the head with his cleaver. He sheared off part of the helmet, but still the helmet parried the blow. Alexander hurled him also to the ground, piercing with his lance through the cuirass into his breast. Spithridates had already raised his scimitar to cut down Alexander, but Clytus, son of Dropides, smartly slipping in, drove at Spithridates' shoulder with his cleaver and shore it off. And now those of the cavalry who had made good their way on the river bank kept coming up and joining the little band round Alexander. Chapter 16. The Persians were now being roughly handled from all quarters, they and their horses being struck in the face with lances. They were driven in front of the cavalry, and were much inconvenienced by the light troops, who became confused with the cavalry, and so they began to give way, first at the very point where Alexander was bearing the brunt of the affray. But when their center began to sag, then the cavalry wings also were pierced, and they turned to flight in earnest. Upwards of 1,000 Persian horsemen perished, for there was not much pursuit, since Alexander turned against the foreign mercenary troops. The mass of these stood their ground, rather rooted to the spot by the unexpected catastrophe than from serious resolution. Bringing his phalanx to bear on them, and bidding the cavalry fall on them from all quarters, he hemmed them in, and soon massacred them. Not one escaped, unless perhaps a few slipped through among the dead. And some 2,000 were taken prisoners. Of Persian commanders there fell Niphates, Patines, Spithridates, satrap of Lydia, Mithrobuzanes, the Cappadocian commandant, Mithridates, son-in-law of Darius, Arbupal, son of Darius, son of Artaxerxes, and Pharnaces, brother of Darius's queen, and Omares, commander of the foreign troops. Arsites fled from the battle into Phrygia, and there, it is said, died by his own hand, because the blame of the Persian failure seemed to lie at his door. Of the Macedonians, among the territorial troops, about 25 fell in the first shock. Brazen statues of them have been set up at Dium. Alexander gave the order to Lysippus, who out of a crowd of competitors had cast the statue of Alexander himself. Of the rest of the cavalry more than 60 perished, and about 30 infantry. All these Alexander buried next day with their arms and other accoutrements. To their parents and children he gave remission of local taxes and of all other personal services and property taxes. He showed much concern about the wounded, visiting each, examining their wounds, asking how they were received, and encouraging each to recount and even boast of his exploits. He buried also the Persian commanders and the mercenary Greeks who fell in the ranks of the foe. Such as he captured, he handcuffed and sent to Macedonia to hard labor, because they had violated Greek public opinion by fighting with Orientals against Greeks. He sent to Athens 300 Persian panoplies as an offering to Athena of Athens. He had this inscription attached: Alexander, son of Philip and the Greeks, save Lacedaemonians, these spoils from the Persians in Asia. Chapter 17. Alexander then made Callus satrap of the satrapy which Arsaces had held, ordering the inhabitants to pay the same taxes as they used to pay to Darius. Such of the natives as came down from the hills and gave themselves up, he bade return to their homes. The city Zelea he exempted from blame, knowing that they had been impressed to fight with the Persians. He sent Parmenio also to take over Dasilion, and this he duly did, the guards having evacuated the place. Then Alexander marched towards Sardis, and when he was still about 70 stades away, there came to him Mithraenes, commander of the Acropolis guard, and with him the chief citizens of Sardis. These gave up the city, and Mithraenes the fortress and the treasure. Alexander himself camped on the Hermus River. This river runs about 20 stades from Sardis, but he sent Amyntas, son of Andromenes, to Sardis to take over the fortress. Mithraenes he took with him, with the honors of his rank, but the Sardians and the other Lydians he permitted to follow the old Lydian customs, and sent them away free. Alexander himself ascended to the fortress. Where was the Persian garrison? He formed no mean opinion of the strength of the position, which was very high, sheer, and fortified all round with a triple wall. Alexander was minded to build a temple on the height to Olympian Zeus, and to set up an altar near it. But as he was surveying the height for the best place, suddenly it was summertime. There brake a storm, with heavy crashes of thunder and violent rain, just over the palace of the Lydian kings. From this Alexander supposed that here was a divine intimation where he must build the temple to Zeus, and so he gave orders accordingly. He left as commandant of the fortress to Pausanias, a territorial officer. Nicias became overseer of the taxes, contributions, and tribute, and Asandrus, son of Philotas, governor of Lydia and the rest of Spithridates' district, and to him he gave cavalry and light troops sufficient for present needs. Callus and Alexander, son of Aropus, he sent to Memnon's country, with the Peloponnesians and the greater part of the allies except the Argives. They were left in Sardis to garrison the fortress. Meanwhile, when the news of the cavalry engagement came through, the mercenary troops garrisoning Ephesus fled with 2 Ephesian triremes, and along with them Amyntas, son of Antiochus, who had run away from Macedon to avoid Alexander. Not that Alexander had done him any harm, but from a general dislike towards Alexander and a disinclination to undergo any disagreeable discomfort at his hands. Alexander reached Ephesus on the 4th day, brought back any exiles who had been turned out of the city on his account, and breaking up the oligarchy, restored the democracy. He also bade them contribute to the temple of Artemis such taxes as they had been paying to the Persians. So the Ephesian people, being now relieved from fear of the oligarchs, promptly put to death all those who had called in Memnon, those who had ransacked the temple of Artemis, and those who had thrown down the statue of Philip in the temple, and had dug up in the marketplace the tomb of Hieropathus, the liberator of the city. Surfax, his son Pelagon, and the children of the brothers of Surfax they drew forth from the temple and stoned. But Alexander prevented further inquisition or punishment, knowing that once permission was given, the people would put to death, together with the guilty, certain others, some from hatred, and some for plunder of their goods. Seldom did Alexander win greater popularity than he did by his treatment of Ephesus. Chapter 18. About this time came representatives of Magnesia and Tralles to Alexander to hand over their cities, so he sent Parmenio with 2,500 allied infantry and as many Macedonians and 200 territorial horse. He sent also Alcimachus son of Agathocles with an equal force to the Aeolian cities and to any Ionian towns still subject to Persia. He ordered the oligarchies everywhere to be broken up, democracies to be established, each to have their own laws and to continue paying the same taxes as they had paid to the Persians. Alexander himself remained in Ephesus and sacrificed to Artemis, and held a great procession with his troops armed cap a pie in full battle order. Next day he took the remainder of the infantry, and the archers and the Agrianes, with the Thracian horse, and the royal squadron of territorial cavalry, and 3 squadrons besides, and marched against Miletus. He captured in his stride what they called the outer city, for the garrison had retired, and camping there he decided to invest the inner city. For Hegesistratus, commandant under Darius of the Milesian garrison, had anticipated matters by sending a letter to Alexander, surrendering the city. But then, taking heart again, because the Persian force was no distance away, schemed to save the city for Persia. Nicanor, however, bringing up the Greek fleet, reached Miletus 3 days ahead of the Persians, and anchored at the island of Lod with 160 ships. Lade is over against Miletus. The Persian fleet were too late, and when their commanders learnt of Nicanor's arrival already at Lade, they anchored under Mount Mycale. For Alexander had by seizing Lade forestalled them, not only by anchoring his fleet there, but also by transporting thither the Thracians and about 4,000 of the other mercenaries. The Persian fleet was of about 400 sail. Parmenio, notwithstanding, urged Alexander to attack, both because he expected the Greeks to win and because of an omen. There had been seen an eagle perching on the shore astern of Alexander's vessels. If they won, he argued, it would be a great help to the expedition generally. A defeat would not be very serious, for even as things were, the Persians held the supremacy at sea. He said that he was willing to embark himself and share all perils. Alexander, however, said that Parmenio's judgment was at fault, his interpretation of the omen not less so. It would be lunacy to fight a much greater fleet with an inferior one, and face the trained crews of the Cyprians and Phoenicians with his own, who had not yet completed their nautical exercises. He would not risk sacrificing the skill and courage of his Macedonians on so uncertain an element to the Persians. Should they lose the engagement, it would be a serious blow to their former warlike prestige, with the Greeks also ready to blaze into revolt at the first whisper of a naval defeat. Arguing thus, he made clear that it was no time to fight, and declared that he interpreted the omen differently, for the eagle was indeed on his own side, but since it was seen sitting on the land, it meant he thought that he would beat the Persian fleet from the land. Chapter 19. Meanwhile, Glaucippus, one of the notables of Miletus, was sent to Alexander by the people and the mercenaries, to whose care the city was chiefly entrusted, and declared that the citizens were prepared to open their walls and harbors to Alexander and the Persians in common. And he demanded on these stipulations that he should raise the siege. Alexander, however, bade Glaucippus to be gone with all speed to the city, and tell the citizens to be ready to fight at dawn. He personally saw to engines being set against the walls, and partly by bombarding the wall at close quarters, and partly by battering it over a great distance, he brought up his force to be ready to rush in wherever the wall was breached or shaken. The Persians from Mycale were close by, and almost beheld their friends and allies under siege. But now Nicanor's fleet from Lade sighted Alexander's attack, and sailed into the harbor of Miletus, rowing along the coast, and, jamming their triremes bows seaward, at the narrowest part of the entrance had bottled up the harbor against the Persian fleet, and cut off Persian help for Miletus. Thereon, the Milesians and the mercenaries, hard pressed on all sides by the Macedonians, some threw themselves into the sea, and using their shields as coracles paddled over to a little nameless island near the city. Others got into pinnaces, and hurrying to get in front of the Macedonian triremes were caught by them at the harbor entrance. But the greater number perished in the city itself. Alexander, the city being now in hand, sailed off against those who had fled to the islet, ordering ladders to be brought to the bows of the triremes, so as to disembark from the ships on the cliffs of the islands, as if on a city wall. But seeing that those on the island were going to fight to the death, he felt compassion for them as noble and loyal soldiers, and made terms with them that they should join his forces. There were about 300 of these Greek mercenaries. The Milesians themselves, save such as fell at the final assault, he dismissed with their freedom. The Persians, using Mycale as a base by daytime, used to sail towards the Greek navy, hoping to provoke an engagement, but at night they did not ride in comfort at Mycale, because they were obliged to get water from the mouths of the Meander, some way off. Alexander with his fleet guarded the harbor of Miletus, that the Persians might not force the entrance, but he sent Philotas to Mycale with the cavalry and 3 columns of infantry, bidding him hinder the Persians from disembarking. So they, from want of water and other things, were as good as besieged in their ships, and sailed off to Samos. Provisioning there, they made for Miletus again. The mass of their vessels they drew up in line out at sea opposite the harbor, hoping to provoke the Macedonians to action in the open. But 5 ships slipped into the harbor between Lade and the camps, hoping to capture Alexander's ships, unmanned, having learned that the crews had for the most part scattered, some to fuel, some to convoy stores, and some detailed for foraging. There was indeed a certain number away from the ships, but Alexander manned 10 ships with the available hands, and when he sighted the 5 Persian ships bearing down, sent these to meet them at full speed with orders to ram. The crews of the 5 Persian ships, seeing the Macedonians making for them the last thing they expected, doubled back, while still at safe distance, and joined the main fleet. One ship manned by Aeacians was captured with its crew in the retreat, being a slow sailer. The other 4 got safe to their own triremes. Thus the Persians left Miletus with nothing done. Chapter 20. Alexander now decided to disband his navy, both from want of money at the time, and also perceiving that his fleet could not face an action with the Persian navy. He had no intention to risk disaster with even a portion of his armament. Further, he reflected that as he now held Asia with his land troops, he no longer needed a navy, and that by capturing the Persian coast bases, he would break up their fleet, since they would have nowhere to make up their crews from, and, in fact, no seaport in Asia. Thus he took the eagle to mean that he should conquer the ships from dry land. When he had settled this, he marched towards Caria, having had reports that a considerable force of Persians and mercenaries had assembled at Halicarnassus. Such cities as lie between Miletus and Halicarnassus he captured on the march, and then encamped against Halicarnassus, at 5 stades distance, settling down for a long siege. For the position of the place made it very strong, and if anything was needed to strengthen it, Memnon had personally seen to this long ago, from the moment he was marked out by Darius for command of all Lower Asia and of the whole fleet. A large force of mercenaries had been left in the city, with many Persians also. The triremes guarded the harbor, so that the sailors too lent much assistance. On the first day it fell out that as Alexander was approaching the wall near the gates leading to Mylasa, there was a sally from the city and volleys at safe distance. This attack Alexander's troops had no difficulty in driving back by a counter-sally, and also safely shut up the attacking party in their walls again. A few days later, Alexander led off his guards, the territorial cavalry, and the infantry battalion of Amyntas, Perdiccas, and Meleager, with the archers and the Agrianes, and went round the city to the side that lay Myndus ward. His idea was to reconnoiter the wall, in case it should prove more open to an assault there, and also to see if perhaps he could capture Myndus by a sudden raid. The capture of Myndus, he thought, would be a great help to a siege of Halicarnassus. A proposal of surrender had been received from Myndus, provided he could arrive there by night. He therefore approached Myndus about midnight, as agreed, but there was no sign of surrender. His engines and ladders he had left behind, naturally enough, since he had not come to besiege, but to receive a treacherous surrender of the city. None the less, he brought up the Macedonian phalanx with orders to sap the wall. One tower they did throw down, yet in its fall it did not strip the wall. The defenders stoutly resisted, and numerous troops by this time had sailed up from Halicarnassus and prevented Alexander from rushing the capture of Myndus. So Alexander retreated with this project a failure, and he kept once more to the siege of Halicarnassus. First he filled level the moat which they had dug before the city, about 30 cubits broad and 15 deep. This was to facilitate the approach of the towers, from which he intended to bombard by volleys of missiles the defenders of the wall, as also of the other engines intended to batter the walls. The ditch was filled up without difficulty, and the towers soon were brought up. The Halicarnassians, however, made a night sally to burn the towers and the other engines which had been brought up, or were in position shortly so to be. But the attackers were easily enclosed again in their city walls by the Macedonian guards and others who, waking up in the course of the action, rushed to their help. The city lost 170 men, including Neoptolemus son of Arrhabaeus, brother of Amyntas, one of those who had deserted to Darius. Of Alexander's troops there fell about 16, but 300 were wounded, since, the sally being at night, they were less protected against wounds. Chapter 21. Not many days after, 2 Macedonian men-at-arms of Perdiccas's battalion, bivouacked together and drinking together, were each exalting his own prowess and deeds. Rivalry arose, assisted by the heating fumes of wine, so they armed themselves and attacked the wall by the height which looks Mylasa way, their idea being to exhibit their strength rather than to force a perilous encounter with the enemy. Some in the city sighted the rash pair approaching the wall, and made a dash out upon them, slaying both these 2 men who were close up, and showering volleys on the more distant troops, confident in their number and in the difficulty of the ground, since the Halicarnassians had the advantage of height for their charge and their volleys. On this more of Perdiccas' men hurried up, and others from the city too, and a stiff fight raged about the wall. Once more the Macedonians drove the sallying force back into the city, and indeed the city was not far from being captured. For the walls were not then carefully guarded, and as 2 towers and 1 intervening curtain had fallen, the approach to the wall had become easy for the army, had they all attacked together. The 3rd tower, moreover, had been badly shaken, and if undermined would easily have been brought down, but the besieged had smartly built out opposite the breach from within a crescent-shaped brick wall, and as they had plenty of builders, they did so with ease. Alexander next day brought up his engines against this wall. Promptly a sally was made to burn them. Part of the fence of mantlets near the walls and one of the wooden towers were burnt. The rest was saved by Philotas and Granicus and their men, who were entrusted with the care of them. But when Alexander also appeared in the assault, they threw away the torches with which they had rushed out, and most cast away their arms and made within the wall. Yet at first, from the position which was commanding, the besieged had the best of it, and did not only volley straight ahead along their line at the advance guard of the engines, but also from the towers left standing on either side of the breach, which enabled them to volley on the flanks and almost at the rear of those who approached the new-built wall. Chapter 22. A few days afterwards, Alexander again brought up his engines to the inner brick wall, taking charge of operations himself, and there was a sally in full force. Some of the enemy attacked near the breach, where Alexander was, others at the triple gate, the last place the Macedonians looked for a sally. Some flung torches at the siege engines, and anything else which might light a flame and spread it to the utmost. But Alexander's immediate supports counterattacked vigorously. Large stones were hurled by the engines from the towers, bullets were showered in volleys, and the besieged were fairly easily repulsed and fled back to the city. They suffered a good deal of loss, proportionate to the number of the attackers and the boldness of their sally. Some fell in hand-to-hand fight with the Macedonians, others about the fallen wall, the passage being too narrow to admit such a number, and the fallen parts of the wall making it difficult to pass over them. As for those who sallied by the triple gate, Ptolemaeus, captain of the bodyguard of Alexander, met them, bringing up the battalions of Aedeus and Timander, and some of the light troops. These two fairly easily drove back the sallying party. This also suffered in the retreat over a narrow bridge thrown over the moat. The bridge gave way under their numbers. Many fell into the moat, some were trampled by their comrades, some the Macedonians shot down from above. The greatest slaughter was round about the gates themselves, for the gates were shut prematurely in panic, the defenders fearing lest the Macedonians, pressing hard upon the fugitives, might enter also. Thus many friends were shut out, to be destroyed by their foes close to the walls. The city indeed came near to capture, had not Alexander sounded the retreat, desirous even now of saving Halicarnassus if the citizens would surrender without further hostility. About 1,000 of these perished, of Alexander's forces about 40. Among these were Ptolemaeus, captain of the bodyguard, Clearchus, in charge of the archers, Aedeus, a captain of 1,000, and other Macedonians of repute. Chapter 23. On this, the leaders of the Persians, Anabasis and Memnon, met and decided that as things were, they could not long hold out against the siege. With part of the wall gone, as they saw, and part badly shaken, many soldiers lost in the sallies, many disabled by wounds. Reviewing all this, about the second watch of the night they burned the wooden tower which they had built to oppose the enemy engines, and also their armories. They fired as well all houses near the walls. Others caught fire from the armories and the tower, where it burned furiously, the wind wafting it in this direction. As for themselves, part retreated to the citadel on the island, part into the height called Salmachus. As soon as this news was reported to Alexander from some who had deserted after the disaster, and as he himself saw the fire spreading, though it took place about midnight, none the less he called up his Macedonians and put to the sword any incendiaries caught in the act, while advising that any citizens found in the houses should be saved. Dawn was breaking, and observing the heights which the Persians and the mercenaries had seized, he decided not to besiege these, considering that it would mean much delay round about them, owing to the nature of the ground, and no great advantage now he had captured the whole city. He buried, therefore, those who had fallen during the night, and ordered the troops detailed for the purpose to withdraw the siege engines to Tralles. Then he razed to the ground the city, and left a garrison for the destroyed city, and for all Caria, and he dispatched 3,000 mercenary foot, 200 horse, under Ptolemaeus, to Phrygia. As satrap of entire Caria, he appointed Ada, daughter of Hecatomnos, wife of Hydrius, who according to Carian custom was both brother and husband. Hydrius on his death had handed over affairs to her. From Semiramis down, the Asians had been used to women rulers. Pixodaris, however, turned her out of her position and assumed the throne himself. On his death, Orontabates, as envoy from the king and brother-in-law of Pixodaris, took over. Ada meanwhile held Alinda only, a very strong fortress of Caria, and when Alexander entered Caria she went to meet him, surrendering Alinda and adopting Alexander as her son. Alexander gave Alinda back to her in charge, and did not reject the adoptive title, and on the capture of Halicarnassus and the rest of Caria, put her in command of the whole. Chapter 24. Some of the Macedonians serving under Alexander had been recently married before taking the field. Alexander thought he ought not to neglect these men, but sent them off from Caria to spend the winter with their wives in Macedonia, putting in charge of them Ptolemaeus son of Seleucus, one of the royal bodyguard, and attaching to him of the officers, Coenus son of Polemocrates, and Meleager son of Neoptolemus, being themselves bridegrooms. He directed them, when they should return and bring back their convoy, to collect horse and foot from the country, as many as they could. Alexander gained as much popularity by this act among the Macedonians as by any other. He sent also Clender son of Polemocrates to collect troops from the Peloponnese. Parmenio he sent to Sardis, giving him a squadron of the territorial cavalry, the Thessalian cavalry, and the other allies in the chariots. He bade him proceed from Sardis to Phrygia. But he himself went towards Lycia and Pamphylia, so that, now he held the coast, he might render useless the enemy's navy. First then on his route he took in his stride Hyparna, a strong place with a mercenary garrison, but the mercenaries receiving terms marched out of the citadel. Then entering Lycia he took over by surrender the Telmicians. Crossing the Xanthus, he received Panara and Xanthus city and Patara in submission, and 30 smaller strongholds. When he had completed all this, in the height of winter, as it now was, he attacked the Millian territory, as it is called. It belongs to Greater Phrygia, but was reckoned then as part of Lycia, according to the king's orders. Their envoys from Phaselis come to offer friendly relations and to crown Alexander with a gold crown. Taking the lead from them, the greater part of Lower Lycia also sent envoys. Alexander bade both the envoys of Phaselis and the Lycians to hand over their cities to those whom he dispatched to take them over, and they were all duly handed over. He came soon after to Phaselis, and took, in conjunction with these, a strong outpost, built to threaten this district by Pisidians, and from which the natives often did much injury to those of Phaselis who were tilling the ground. Chapter 25. While Alexander was still busied about Phaselis, he received news that his namesake, son of Aripus, was meditating treachery, one of the companions, and at the moment commanding the Thracian cavalry. This Alexander was brother to Hieromenes and Arrhabaeus, who had a part in the murder of Philip. Though he had incurred blame, Alexander let him off for the nonce, since he had been among the first of his friends to rally to him on Philip's death, and had put on his cuirass and accompanied Alexander into the palace. Later Alexander had even held him in a post of honor near his person, and had sent him to command in Thrace, and when Callus, commander of the Thracian cavalry, had been transferred to a satrapy, Alexander appointed him commander of the Thracian horse. The story of the plot was reported as follows. Darius, when Amyntas deserted to him, bringing overtures and a letter from this lesser Alexander, sent Sicenes, a trusty Persian from his suite, to the coast. The pretext was that he was to visit Attizues, satrap of Phrygia, but in fact he was to meet this Alexander and give him certain assurances, if he would assassinate Alexander the king, that the Persian king would give him the throne of Macedonia and 1,000 gold talents to boot. Sisinnes fell into Parmenio's hands and revealed to him the cause of his mission, and Parmenio sent him under escort to Alexander, who heard from him the same story. So he called together his friends and held a council to see what should be decided about the traitor. The companions held that Alexander had originally done unwisely in giving over the best of the cavalry to an untrustworthy officer, and that he should now get rid of him as soon as possible, before he got too familiar with the Thracians and headed some revolt. They also were troubled by an omen, for while Alexander was still besieging Halicarnassus and was taking his midday rest, a swallow circled over his head, chattering noisily, and perched here and there on his bed. Its note showed more alarm than the usual swallow's twittering. Alexander, from wariness, could not be awakened, but troubled by the twittering he gently brushed away the swallow. But the bird would not fly off when touched. Rather it perched on Alexander's very head, and kept on till Alexander fully awoke. Alexander, taking the incident seriously, reported it to Aristander of Telmissus, the seer. He replied that it meant treachery of some friend, but also the meaning was that this should come to light. For the swallow is a domestic bird, friendly to man, and a greater chatterer than any other bird. Putting this together with the Persian story, he sent to Parmenio Amphoterus, son of Alexander, brother of Craterus, and at the same time some Pergian guides. Amphoterus wore a native dress so as not to be recognized on the journey, and so came safe to Parmenio. He brought no letter from King Alexander. It was thought unwise to commit anything to writing in a matter of this sort, but he gave a verbal message as directed. Thus Alexander was arrested and kept under guard. Chapter 26. Leaving Phasaelis, Alexander sent part of his force through the mountain passes towards Perga, where the Thracians had made him a road, the round journey being difficult and long. He himself led his immediate followers along the coast, a route practicable only with north winds blowing. South winds make the passage along the shore impossible. There had been heavy southerlies, but a north wind had set in, this by divine interposition, as Alexander and his staff interpreted it, and made the passage easy and swift. As he went on from Perga, there met him on the way plenipotentiaries from Aspendus surrendering the city, but begging it might not be garrisoned. This point they won, but Alexander exacted from them 50 talents for the army as pay and all such horses as they bred as tribute to the king of Persia. They agreed to hand over both, and so departed. Alexander now went towards Side, whose inhabitants are Cymaeans from Aeolian Cyme. They give this account of themselves, that as soon as they reached that land, the first to leave Cyme, sailing thither to colonize, they forgot their native tongue and talked a foreign language straight away, and that not the Persian of the natives there, but their own idiom, in fact, a new dialect. Henceforward the citizens of Ciad had been so many foreigners, contrary to the ways of their neighbors. Alexander left a guard at Side and went on to Cilium, a fortified place with a garrison of mercenaries, and also of the natives of those parts. But he could not take Cilium in his stride, and besides it was reported on his march that the Aspendians were not minded to fulfill their obligations, neither to hand over the horses to the party sent to fetch them, nor to pay the money. Nay, they had got their stuff in from the fields, had shut their gates upon Alexander's envoys, and were repairing weak places in their walls. Learning this, Alexander marched towards Aspendus. Chapter 27. This city is built for the most part on a strong height, sheer, looking over the river Eurymedon. Round this height on the flat they had a number of dwellings and a small wall built round these. This wall, so soon as they were aware of Alexander's approach, the inhabitants deserted, and also the houses built on the level such as they thought it not possible to safeguard. They all took refuge on the height. Alexander, arriving with full force, entered within the deserted wall and camped in the empty houses. But the citizens, as soon as they saw Alexander himself, arrived, just what they had not looked for, and his army all round them sent envoys and begged to be allowed to surrender on the old terms. Alexander, seeing that the position was strong, and being himself not ready for a long siege, yet refused the original terms. He demanded their most influential men as hostages, and that they should hand over the horses they had previously promised and 100 talents in place of 50, that they should give obedience to the satrap appointed by him, and pay yearly tribute to Macedon, an inquiry to be held, moreover, about the territory of their neighbors, which they were accused of having taken by violence and now retaining. All now satisfactorily arranged, Alexander moved to Perga, and thence began his march to Phrygia, which led past Telmissus. The Telmissians are Pisidians in origin, uncivilized, and inhabit a very lofty position, precipitous all round. The road past the city is an awkward one. A height runs from the city up to the road, and there ends, but opposite is a height equally abrupt. These heights make natural gates on the road, and a small guard can cut off all approach by holding them. The Telmissians on this occasion came out in full force and occupied both heights. Alexander, seeing this, bade the Macedonians camp where they were, knowing that the Telmissians, seeing them bivouacking, would not wait there in force, but would, for the most part, drift away to the city close by, leaving on the heights only a guard. His guess proved right. Most of them moved off, the guards remained. At once bringing up against them the archers, the javelin battalions, and the lighter-clad men-at-arms, he led them against the enemy, who at the first volleys gave ground, leaving the position on which Alexander passed the narrow passage and encamped near the city. Chapter 28. At this point arrived envoys from the Selgians, who are also native Pisidians with a large city, a warlike people. They had been for some time at enmity with the Telmissians, and so had sent an embassy to Alexander to ask for his friendship. Alexander granted their wish and found them wholly trustworthy allies. He concluded that a siege of Telmissus would be a long one, and so moved on to Sagalassus, also a fairly large city, inhabited by Pisidians, the most warlike of this warlike tribe. They then occupied the hill in front of the city, which was as strong for defensive operations as the wall itself, and held their ground. Alexander therefore thus deployed the Macedonian phalanx. On the right wing, his own post, he had the bodyguard, and in touch with them the territorial foot, right up to the left wing, all under the battalion officers in the order of precedence for the day. On the left he placed Amintas son of Arrhabaeus in command. Then in advance on the right wing were posted the archers and the Agrianes, on the left the Thracian javelin men under Sitalces, for the cavalry were of no use to him in this narrow space. Along with the Pisidians were ranged Telmissians who had come to help. Already Alexander's immediate troops had thrown themselves on the height held by the Pisidians, and were now at the most steep part of the ascent, whereon the Pisidians attacked in ambuscades on either wing where they could best approach, and the Macedonians were most hampered. They drove back the archers, being lightly armed and in the advanced line, but the Agrianes held firm, for the Macedonian phalanx was coming up, and Alexander himself was visible at its head. The battle becoming hand-to-hand, the unarmed natives charging hoplites were wounded, and falling on all sides, at length gave way. Some 500 perished. Being light and knowing the country, they got away easily. The Macedonians, from weight of armor and want of local knowledge, had little heart for the pursuit. Alexander, however, kept on the heels of the fugitives and stormed the city, losing Cleandrus, the commander of the archers, and some 20 others. Then he attacked the remaining Pisidians, capturing many of their forts and receiving the surrender of others. Chapter 29. Thence he passed into Phrygia by Lake Ascania, where salt gathers naturally and is used by the inhabitants, who thus need no sea salt. In 5 days he reached Selene, where is a steep acropolis, held by a garrison under the satrap of Phrygia, 1,000 Carians and 100 Greek mercenaries. They sent envoys to Alexander, offering, in case help did not come to them on a day previously appointed, this date they specified, to surrender the position. Thus Alexander thought better than a siege of this unassailable position. So he left 1,500 troops as a guard over Selene. Then he waited there 10 days and appointed Antigonus, son of Philip, satrap, and in his place as commander of the allies, Balacrus, son of Amyntas. Then he set out towards Gordium, ordering Parmenio to meet him there with his force, and so he did. The recently married Macedonians who had gone to Macedonia also made their rendezvous at Gordium, and with them a freshly levied army, led by Ptolemaeus, son of Seleucus, Coenus, son of Polemocrates, and Meleager, son of Neoptolemus. There were 3,000 Macedonian foot, 300 horse, 200 Thessalian horse, 150 Eleans under Alcaeus the Elean. Gordium, you must know, is in Hellespontine Phrygia, on the river Sangarius, the springs of which are in Phrygia. It runs through Bithynian Thrace into the Euxine. There also an embassy arrived from Athens, begging Alexander to release to them Athenian prisoners captured on the Granicus, fighting on the Persian side, and now under arrest in Macedonia with the 2,000 captives. Their request was not, however, granted, and so they departed. Alexander did not think it wise, with the Persian war still in progress, to relax any terrors for the Greeks who had actually fought with foreigners against Greece. But he answered that when things proved satisfactory, they were to approach him again on the same subject. Our audiobook ends here. Thank you for listening. If you want any particular book in this channel, please let us know in the comments.